It's February 27th, 2026. Warner Brothers has been sold to Paramount. Rumors surrounding the future of James Gunn and his DCU circulate. It's April 8th, 2022. Warner Brothers has merged with Discovery. Rumors surrounding the future of Zack Snyder and his DCEU circulate. In summer 2013, Zack Snyder releases Man of Steel. It's a superhero movie that splits opinion online and makes $670 million. The film will be referred to as a commercial failure. In summer 2025, James Gunn releases Superman, a Superman movie that splits opinion online and makes $618 million. The film is heralded as a massive commercial success. It's October 25th, 2022. James Gunn and Peter Safran are officially named co-CEOs of DC Studios. James Gunn is immediately proclaimed the savior of DC under Warner Brothers. His fans promise that he will usher in an era of unprecedented success at DC Studios. In March 2016, Batman vs. Superman is released as the second installment in the DCEU. It's a critical failure, but makes $874 million. In June 2026, Supergirl is released as the second film in James Gunn's DCU. It's a critical failure, and will be lucky to make $200 billion. After just 2 DCU movies, even James Gunn's most staunch defenders are speculating that he'll be out as head of DC Studios, something they said was an impossibility just months before.
So how did it come to this? We have been hearing for years that anything other than vicious praise of James Gunn was unwarranted. The defenses of James Gunn have usually boiled down to the intellectual and cinephile equivalent of James Gunn is just built different. But what's fascinating about James Gunn is not his movies. It's the space he occupies in the public consciousness. I think to really grasp the strange nature of the discourse surrounding James Gunn, you have to be honest and separate his films from the level of praise and defense he has received from online commentators. And yes, there are also many people critical of James Gunn, but those voices are usually drowned out by the James Gunn worship. Praise that so often feels coordinated amongst industry commentators and publications, and of course, Warner Brothers executives. And look, we have watched James Gunn's films back before he became this industry poster boy for comic book movies. Back when you could appraise a director's work film to film. So seeing the narrative around him evolve has been strange. And the defensiveness and cult-like myth-making around James Gunn exposes how movies aren't really movies anymore. At least they aren't in the way we traditionally think of them. They're products used to reaffirm public sentiment, corporate interests, and political beliefs. It's easy to romanticize filmmaking and want to believe that Hollywood really is an industry built on people of unparalleled passion and talent. People who set out with the singular focus of creating their art. Art that they believe will speak to the audience and create a lasting personal and cultural impact. But the recent discourse around James Gunn and DC Studios betrays just how much corporate interests and crony journalism steers the window of film discussion. I think what makes this whole situation feel so obvious is the way the contradictions surrounding James Gunn's myth have come to a head, exposing just how artificial this myth-making was from the very start. Section 1. The myth of James Gunn's unparalleled talent. Ryan Coogler's Oscar wins for Sinners exposes the blind spot many commentators have when discussing James Gunn. Over the past couple years, we have seen a ridiculous inflation in the assessment of James Gunn's talent. And I say this as someone who has enjoyed many of James Gunn's films. But the recent elevation of his filmmaking has been absurd. Many of Gunn's most passionate supporters seem to inhabit more traditional centers of film discussion and publications. And for years, those supporters have referred to James Gunn as the best director in the comic book space. That quickly escalated to James Gunn as one of the best directors in Hollywood. Before long, many people no longer felt the need to include one of when proclaiming his greatness. And this probably seems insignificant, or just like the usual fan overexcitement leading to them losing perspective. And while that is definitely part of it, the myth-making around James Gunn seems to be more resilient and lead to people entering a sort of cognitive dissonance. I have seen many variations of this line of thinking in the movie and Hollywood commentator space. And the thinking seems to boil down to something like, Guardians of the Galaxy is my favorite superhero movie. Superhero movies have become the driving force at the box office. Guardians is the best film in the group of the most important types of films being made. Therefore, everything should be like Guardians of the Galaxy. And thus, James Gunn is the most valuable and talented director working. Now, obviously, anyone with even a little bit of perspective would realize how ridiculous that line of thinking actually is. I think most people see the huge cognitive leaps, false premises, and just overall flawed thinking in that argument. But many commentators and publications who know better regurgitate these sorts of arguments and assumptions. Even people who should know better and have demonstrated the ability to call out such thinking when it comes to other directors or creatives. Which brings us back to Ryan Coogler's Oscar success. By the industry's own metric, Ryan Coogler is a far more talented director than James Gunn. None of James Gunn's superhero films have crossed the billion-dollar mark, whereas Ryan Coogler's Black Panther did. None of James Gunn's non-superhero movies have garnered that much praise, certainly nowhere near as much as Coogler's. Yet not only did the inflated opinions of Gunn's skills as a filmmaker continue, and this was in a year when Sinners and Superman both came out, but the narrative that James Gunn was not only the best director to come out of Marvel, but just one of the best directors to come out of Hollywood in general was still circulating. But I think that between Sinners and Superman, you really see the capabilities of both directors when they have absolute creative control. Now, this is not about which film you prefer. And it's definitely not about the political rhetoric that surrounds films in Hollywood and the Academy Awards, though we will talk about that later. Simply put, Sinners is a better made film. The techniques and decisions made work better and demonstrate far more filmmaking competency than Superman. I honestly don't think that's a controversial take, but many people stumped for Superman to win big at the Academy Awards. Warner Brothers even submitted Superman for a bunch of award categories. Now, do I think that it matters that Superman received no Oscars and wasn't even considered for the categories that it applied for? No, I don't think that the Oscars are all that important to most people when defining what films they appreciate. But I do know that it matters to the types of commentators and publications that spend so much time building the narrative around James Gunn. It's almost like they have completely convinced themselves that Gunn is such an auteur, that he is such a genius that they can no longer properly evaluate his films. And therefore, every decision he makes, even if it doesn't work, must be further evidence of his trailblazing genius. It seems like many of the people in and around Hollywood are no longer in the business of discussing film, but now in the business of myth-making. Section 2. Why the myth is so important.
Myths are the stories we tell when logic and reason are insufficient in explaining the world around us. Conventional wisdom regarding the success and influence of Hollywood is being challenged, and therefore myth is all many of these commentators have left. It seems that the most important narrative in Hollywood recently has been that the success of James Gunn is never questioned. We are currently at a crossroad that exposes how artificial the narrative surrounding James Gunn really is. The acquisition of Warner Bros. By Paramount seems to be exposing the true value of James Gunn to Hollywood. It's pretty obvious that politics has infiltrated nearly every sector of public discourse. For years, it's become increasingly obvious how many films have been more invested in performative signaling to a political base rather than creating art. I'm not suggesting that art cannot be political or that it has not been political in the past, but what I think people have noticed is a combination of just how heavy-handed the political messaging has become, and the fact that in many instances, the politics are telegraphed long before the film or show even comes out. This sort of political pandering rarely, if ever, creates great art, and is really just an attempt to rally a base that will support the project out of political tribalism. I think a large part of James Gunn's recent significance stems from the way he has become this puppet for thinly veiled political discourse. And up until recently, it was both sides of the American political alignment that tried to hold up James Gunn and his work as proof that their side was winning. When Superman came out, there were commentators fawning over the comments being made by Gunn's brother and other actors against MAGA conservatives. At the same time, conservative entertainment pundits were praising James Gunn's comments about Superman being for everyone. Some especially misguided pundits even believed that Gunn and David Zaslav would usher in an era of ultra-based, anti-woke entertainment, and all the pushback against Gunn was simply the Hollywood Illuminati afraid of David Zaslav's attempt to rescue America from the woke mind virus. And as absolutely ridiculous as that sounds, that was a real opinion circulating when Superman was set to release. I love conspiracy theories, but I don't think these lines of thinking help us evaluate or understand what we like or dislike about films. Mythology serves as a way of understanding and explaining the world around us. The human mind often works through myths, even when we don't realize it. I don't actually think Gunn himself is the originator of much of the lore surrounding him. Sadly, I think he's a surrogate for a more meaningful vessel, one that can encapsulate the political discussion people are clearly trying to instigate. And it just demonstrates the desperate need of a deeply politically divided world to align all things to a place of ideological safety. And the problem is, this has made discussing James Gunn very difficult, because the conversation almost always devolves into a thinly veiled political rant.
Section 3. The origins of James Gunn's political importance. I think you can trace James Gunn's path from niche filmmaker to a tool of vicarious political debate back to his firing from Marvel. I think this is the starting point for the death of nuance when evaluating James Gunn's work and his place in Hollywood. For anyone who isn't aware, James Gunn was fired after an enormous number of his tweets resurfaced. You can almost tell exactly where someone falls in terms of political opportunism by how they refer to the content of those tweets. Because the pundit who sees value in James Gunn politically will usually refer to the tweets as edgy humor. I think this is because discussing the subject matter of the tweets will often lead to community guideline violations, and the fact that most people, even those who defend Gunn, find it deeply uncomfortable to mention what he actually wrote. But regardless of the implications of the tweets, what ensued was a very public example of political tribalism in Hollywood. Pretty quickly, Hollywood's cancel culture moved from exposing actual crimes and into political whataboutisms. People still argue over who got James Gunn canceled. But in the grand scheme of things, I don't think that really matters all that much, because James Gunn has become almost like a modern-day folk hero. And to the people who view him as such, they tend to subscribe to the belief that Gunn was canceled by conservatives, and therefore supporting his work is tantamount to fighting their political opponents. He is not the only creative that has become a proxy of political discussion in Hollywood. We saw something similar happen with Paul Thomas Anderson's One Battle After Another. As you would expect, this has led to the sort of circling the wagons that occurs every time something in entertainment becomes a proxy for political tribalism. I think this is why discussing James Gunn can feel like a bit of a rug pull. If you want to sincerely discuss and evaluate his ability as a storyteller and filmmaker, you can often find yourself in a discussion with bad faith actors who try to pivot to political or social issues. I think that this is why there are so many contradictions when discussing James Gunn. For example, he will be described by his defenders as a wholesome and hopeful filmmaker. But to do this, they have to ignore his past edgy humor, as they would call it, in most of his filmography. For the most part, there seems to be no willingness to cede ground when discussing James Gunn. He is a director who is defended in absolutes. And this leads to a lot of cognitive dissonance, which all leads into the feeling that James Gunn is more the head of a cult of personality and loosely held together by political opportunists rather than true lovers of film. And I do want to point out that there are people that truly love his films, and this is in no way an attack on those people. People who like his movies for the sake of the movies tend to be able to make good faith arguments as to what they like and dislike about them. But the people that have contributed to this unnatural James Gunn mythos are usually identifiable by their inability to navigate discussing his work without contradicting themselves. Section 4. The most comic accurate director myth.
One of the arguments that makes these contradictions the most obvious is a conversation as to whether James Gunn is a comic accurate director. Now, the argument itself is not actually proof of his ability as a filmmaker. A great director can make a great film that's not comic accurate, and a terrible director can make a film that is just awful, but happens to be page for page comic accurate. But the comic accuracy defense of his work is often held up as a shield to criticism. If someone doesn't like one of James Gunn's superhero adaptations, you'll often hear people say something like, well, you obviously don't read comics, because James Gunn is the most comic accurate director ever. The problem is this argument is dishonest for many reasons, mostly because it's simply not true. The most honest assessment would be that James Gunn is successful when he can pluck less-known characters from the comics and morph them into something he's more comfortable with. Amongst his honest fans, they'll admit that James Gunn works best when creating ensemble films of lesser-known comic characters. These fans tend to have no problem admitting that James Gunn made massive, fundamental changes to the Guardians of the Galaxy and Peacemaker. At the end of the day, people will like what they like. And if they like James Gunn's version of these characters, then that's kind of the best outcome someone can get out of a movie. Like many others, I had no frame of reference for these characters before James Gunn adapted them to the screen, so I was able to enjoy them for what they were. But after Gunn piqued my interest in these characters, I went down a rabbit hole trying to find this version of these characters in the comics. And they simply do not exist outside of James Gunn's interpretation. I think it's important to remember that something can be reinterpreted and still be enjoyable. I enjoy Keanu Reeves' version of John Constantine as its own separate thing, but I would never feel the need to defend it as comic accurate to a fan who felt that it was too great a departure from what they were expecting. I think this is a major indicator that the defense of Gunn has less to do with his work and more to do with protecting him from criticism. This has become all the more apparent when looking at Peacemaker and the Supergirl film he greenlit, both of which are being recognized as massive departures from the comics. For every person waking up to the fact that maybe James Gunn isn't as comic accurate as everybody wanted to believe, there are others who feel the need to protect James Gunn, his vision, and his DCU even as their previous arguments failed them. If facts and reality must be ignored to protect the image of Gunn that his myth necessitates, they seem to be willingly sacrificed.
Section 5. How the call for comic accuracy was co-opted. The way in which James Gunn wrapped himself in the fantasy of the comic-accurate director is a big part of why it has become so difficult to discuss his work on merit. In a way, his most loyal acolytes have morphed the meaning of comic accuracy. Initially, comic accuracy meant that the adaptation would remain true to the characters in the comics, that the adaptation would maintain the spirit and nature of the characters, and maybe even adapt specific storylines from the comics. Obviously, comics have many different runs, and therefore most of the time an adaptation has to work through the collection and find the universal aspects of the characters and stories, or pull from the most popular run. What James Gunn tends to do is reduce comic adaptations to an aesthetic that is recognizable as comic booky. Often the specifics and defining traits of characters are ground down to fit into the templated story he wants to tell. The thing is, it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more comic book films that are made adhering to this aesthetic that Gunn has contributed to, the more the approach feels validated. The more it feels like an axiom. What confuses people is that Gunn is very good at perusing the comic archives to find niche examples from the comics to reinforce the image of his comic book knowledge, as well as promoting his films with photos of the actors reading comic books. But this does not equate to fidelity. In the same way that most people would understand that Amazon's Rings of Power is not faithful to the characters that Tolkien created simply because it can pull references to prove they are aware of the source material. And I am not saying that Gunn's work is as egregious as what Amazon has done with the Rings of Power. Just that Gunn similarly uses the source material as a very loose framework for telling the stories he wants to tell. It's the difference between a creator using a character and story as a vessel for the story that they want to tell, versus reading a story and feeling moved to adapt that story sincerely. And Gunn has admitted that this is the case when he spoke about initially struggling to connect with Superman and needing to find a way in. But the comic accuracy myth is all but shattered after the release of Supergirl, a movie that failed to capture the appeal of the comic which inspired it. With a script that the writer admits fundamentally gets the story and ending wrong because she did not understand the comic. What makes this worse is that James Gunn never caught this when reading her script, one that he vouched for as being of the highest quality. All the while talking about how much he loved the comic Woman of Tomorrow, which the movie is based on. A comic written by Tom King. Someone that Gunn has gone to great lengths to remind the public he's keeping around and is integral to the DCU. But clearly not integral enough to understand his comic, or even involve him enough in the production of Supergirl to catch the mistake. But seriously though, it's kinda crazy that they didn't just ask Tom King, especially when James Gunn has leveraged this idea that he was going to do these characters and their stories justice. I think a big reason this myth of Gunn being comic accurate has been so prevalent is because comic book fans have felt ignored as superhero movies transition from being a more niche interest to broad appeal blockbusters. I think that comic fans felt that some of the uniqueness of comics was stripped away to make it more appealing to people who were unfamiliar with the medium. I think that things like bright colors, comic accurate costumes, and niche references became tokens of appeal to the comic community. This was a big reason there was such excitement for Deadpool and Wolverine. After years of corporate studios managing the look of Wolverine to avoid making him look too comic booky, seeing him in his yellow suit felt like an acknowledgement. But the thing is, these sorts of symbols can easily be used to distract from a story that does not embody the nature of the characters. This has led to a stalemate where discussing James Gunn tends to run into dead ends, especially when the metric to discuss his work becomes comic accuracy. To some, the superficial references and symbols have them convinced that he is doing justice to the characters, that he cares more deeply for these stories and characters than any other director in Hollywood. And therefore, anything he creates is good because he has, in their mind, demonstrated comic accuracy. The need for the label of comic accuracy is so important that it has become a powerful marketing tool, one that is easily used to manufacture public sentiment. Section 6. The preordained DCU.
The manipulation of public sentiment regarding James Gunn and his DCU was most evident when he was initially hired. Gunn's saga as the head of DC Studios has always felt preordained. Gunn was anointed the savior of DC before a single project was announced or frame was shot. When it was announced that he would be taking over at DC Studios, there were many commentators giddy over the news, but it always felt like an inordinate amount of enthusiasm. The claims that we would finally get a good DC universe felt excessive, but also scripted, and there was almost a religious fervor surrounding the discussion. There were a lot of people saying that his success with the Guardians of the Galaxy was proof he could run DC Studios. But even that exposed a sort of defensiveness in the James Gunn mythos. I get that there are people who love Guardians of the Galaxy and just want him to do that again at DC Studios. Though I don't agree with that sentiment, it at least makes sense. If Guardians of the Galaxy is your favorite superhero film, it makes sense why you might want James Gunn to slap a thick coat of the Guardians all over DC to make it more palatable. But what was always strange were the people who would point to the Guardians of the Galaxy movies as proof that James Gunn was the right guy for the DC job, but maintained that Gunn's DC run would be nothing like his Guardians films, and that would be a good thing. There was a resentment towards any criticism of Gunn's Guardians movies, but also a rejection of the possibility that they would form the creative template for his DC run. If you pointed out that Gunn seems to be most capable when dealing with ensemble films, people would agree. If you pointed out that he tends to use it as a crutch, and that may hinder his ability to work on films that people want to be solo films, like Superman, people tended to melt down. It created a situation where some of James Gunn's worst decisions were obvious from a mile away to anyone paying attention, but appeared to be a mystery to those who defended him, the people who claimed to be his biggest fans. And this is where the contradictions and cognitive dissonance are exposed. If the narrative is that James Gunn is a comic accurate director, then he cannot simply come in and turn DC into Guardians of the Galaxy, because that wouldn't be accurate to the DC characters. But the Guardians of the Galaxy films are the formula and aesthetic that has dominated the concept of comic accuracy. Intellectually, I think many people know that James Gunn really only thrives in these sort of ensemble films. But the need for him to succeed at DC blinded many to his weaknesses as a creator. Supergirl being a knockoff version of James Gunn's style only further proves how one-note his vision for the DCU truly is. Whether that's through direct interference, a studio mandate, or simply James Gunn only hiring writers and directors that appeal to his personal taste, the result is the same. An entire universe built on replicating the things James Gunn likes.
Section 7. The corporate manipulation. I think it should be obvious by now that Gunn's exaltation was not simply the work of enthusiastic fans. Gunn was brought in by David Zaslav to create the illusion of momentum and excitement for the future as Warner Bros. Geared up for its inevitable acquisition. Commentators well versed in the James Gunn dogma will argue that James Gunn was announced well before Paramount's initial bid to buy Warner Bros., while ignoring that Zaslav was clearly brought in from the beginning to prepare the company for a sale. Everything from Zaslav's history at Discovery, his Warner Bros. Contract, and the restructuring of Warner Bros. Made it very clear that Warner Bros. Were always looking to be acquired. DC is one of Warner Bros.' most valuable assets, but has also become one of its biggest embarrassments. Years of dismal box office returns and the inability to catch Marvel has severely diminished the brand. But to get top dollar in a sale, Warner Bros. Need to build up a facade that there was a path to success. Literal billions of dollars were tied to the narrative that Warner Brothers was back on track, and the image of a resurgence from DC Studios was important to that story. It was the equivalent to the studio saying, "No low bids, I know what I've got." This is a big part of why things have felt so manufactured around James Gunn's appointment and run as head of DC Studios. His credentials have been overstated. His failures have all been explained away or brushed off. His personal brand has largely replaced the DC characters as the go-to tool for marketing. The past couple of years have felt like Warner Brothers marketing was begging everyone to ignore their eyes and ears and just trust Gunn. And this led to a lot of sloganeering, especially amongst the online community. Things like, "James Gunn has never let me down," "The Gunn never jams," and many more. DC Studios has felt more like a campaign than a creative studio. A campaign built on the central narrative of "In James Gunn we trust," that he has never failed, that he cannot fail. Section 8, what happens when myths fall apart.
Which brings us to the crossroads at which we currently find ourselves. James Gunn has not yet delivered the DC universe that was promised. And with Warner Brothers being sold to Paramount, there's a growing belief that he never will. Questions are starting to bubble to the surface. Questions about why he chose to prioritize the projects he did. Questions about what happened to his initial slate. And even questions as to whether he is truly as indispensable as his myth suggests. Now, this could be a moment when cooler heads prevail. We could look at the current entertainment news and commentary landscape and see how it's been manipulated to lead us to this point. We could return to reason and recognize that there were interests that aligned, which sought to overpromise and underdeliver. Publications and pundits who saw in James Gunn an opportunity to achieve objectives that have nothing to do with his ability as a filmmaker. That quelled discussion and good faith evaluation of his work because he was useful as a symbol for their respective causes. Or we could simply double down on the myth-making. We could raise the stakes and elevate James Gunn from folk hero to outright superhero defending all that is righteous and good. And sadly, that is what seems to be happening. Now that it's more likely than ever that James Gunn will not complete his DCU, his backers are panicking as they try to craft a narrative that will maintain his value. There is a great deal of uncertainty regarding James Gunn's future for the first time in years. Under Warner Brothers, you could rest assured his place was secure because they would not want the embarrassment of another reboot. Under Paramount, the stigma of cleaning house and starting again is not as detrimental. In fact, it's usually what happens. James Gunn could easily be allowed to leave when his contract is up in 2027. Paramount could easily decide to go in another direction because James Gunn has yet to create something for DC Studios that proves he is too valuable to replace. But that simple explanation would not satisfy the myth. Instead, his legacy is being fortified. James Gunn will not be allowed to go down as the latest creator who failed to bring together a cohesive DC universe. No, James Gunn's a great man. A man so great, he will resign in protest before he ever works for the Ellisons at Paramount. This is a narrative that's been brought to life by a pundit who admits to not having spoken to James Gunn. And look, people can report whatever they want. But this feels like a faith-based speculation. It feels like this was spoken while wearing a bracelet with the letters WWJGD. What would James Gunn do? And because James Gunn has become a symbol, he can do whatever he wants as long as it maintains the flow of political discourse living vicariously through entertainment. This sort of opportunism is self-fulfilling. If James Gunn is let go or not renewed, he will become a symbol of resistance to Paramount. If James Gunn feels the way the wind is blowing and wants to resign before he's let go, then he'll be anointed a hero fighting for one tribe's politics. But even if James Gunn stays and decides to work with the Ellisons at Paramount, he won't be called a traitor. It'll be claimed that he chose to stay as a resistance leader inside of Paramount. It'll be said that he knows he can achieve more politically and socially by keeping himself inside the beast, rather than leaving. On the flip side, the other political tribe will claim him staying as a win, because it means the Ellisons are reining in the behavior they don't like. And if he leaves, it'll be said that he was kicked to the curb by a studio that's returning to the values and symbolism that matters to their side. In no reality is James Gunn just a director who made some movies. In no instance is he just a guy trying to keep his job or maintain control over the optics of his brand.
And I think that speaks to why the myth of James Gunn is so persistent. not because it's unique to him, but because this is the sort of stories that get told when people and communities become deeply divided. You can like or dislike James Gunn and his films, but I think what has made this saga most fascinating has been how it has become evident that it was never as much about his films as it was about what he could symbolize. I think when you notice this pattern with James Gunn, you can see how many other public figures, especially in Hollywood, fulfill this role. I think it's a big part of why discussing movies can feel so exhausting. We're not connecting with art and discussing the interpretations of that art to better understand ourselves and one another. Often, we simply find ourselves caught between competing myths. And it's almost impossible to reason with someone whose need to believe in something is more important to them than the truth. Congratulations on making it to the end. Thank you for watching. We have upcoming videos about what's wrong with needle drops and why entertainment media seems so weird lately. If that sounds interesting to you, be sure to subscribe so you get notified when they drop. And a special thank you to everyone who subscribes to the channel. Let us know what you think in the comments. And of course, a massive thank you to everyone who supports us here and on Patreon.